Hi, I'm Sarah Butcher, and this is the Side Comment. In this episode, Richard Hingley discusses Roman Emperor Hadrian's trip to Britain in 122 AD and the significance of the wall that still bears his name 1,900 years later.
Hadrian came to power in 117 CE, and he inherited the empire from Trajan. Now, Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, had campaigned over quite extensive territories, and he conquered a lot of new land. And we know that when Hadrian came to power, he immediately started having some military problems with uprisings in various parts of the empire. And Hadrian obviously wanted to deal with this by being less militaristic. So Hadrian obviously did authorize military actions against people who were fighting the empire on its frontiers. But his main ambition was to formalize and rationalize the Roman frontiers and the Roman frontier military units. Now, Hadrian came to Britain 1,900 years ago. We'd think he would come during the sort of summer season when the sea is much calmer. And we know he was in Germany before he travels to Britain. So we would imagine, although we don't actually know, that Hadrian was probably in Britain in July or August. And it would also be probable that Hadrian wouldn't spend actually very long in Britain. He was in Germany previously and he traveled to Gaul. So he might only have been in Britain for a few weeks. Now, he'd been inspecting the frontier forces in Germany, and he'd been actually already promoting the defences in Germany. So we know that they started building defensive palisades in Germany the year before Hadrian visited. We know that through dendrochronology, tree ring analysis of some preserved timbers and palisades. And Hadrian was obviously prioritizing Germany and Britain because he visited a lot of the provinces of the Roman Empire during his reign, but he went to Germany and Britain relatively early in his provincial tours. And we have to be honest and say that we have really sketchy information about what Hadrian was doing in Britain. No classical author really gives us any detailed account of Hadrian's activities. They just effectively tell us he traveled to Britain, and they tell us he traveled with his wife and an entourage. Now, because he was very busy inspecting military units, the northern frontier of Britain at the time, where all the soldiers would have been in the summer, was along the line where Hadrian's Great Wall was to be built. And we think that before Hadrian visits Britain, so early in his reign, there was really quite a major uprising in Britain. In fact, this is the time at which historically it's argued, or it has been argued, the Ninth Legion was defeated and eventually disbanded or totally destroyed. And that story, as you may know, has been dismissed over the last 20 years. It was the origin of the novel by Sutcliffe, The Eagle, which is quite well known. Just recently, archaeologists have been reassessing the information again, and it's been suggested again that the Ninth Legion may actually have been lost in Britain beyond the northern frontier during those early years of Hadrian's reign. So you can imagine that Hadrian was visiting Britain because of this major uprising, which had almost certainly been put down by the time he visits in 122. Now, Hadrian obviously had a real interest in Britain and the security of Britain, and we know this because during Hadrian's reign, a series of provincial coins were issued. So coins, the Roman Empire ran on coinage really, coins showing the provinces of the Roman Empire. And interestingly, although quite a number of the Roman provinces were shown on Hadrian's coins, the first province to be featured on the series of Hadrian's coins was Britain. And Britain is portrayed on these coins, and this is early in Hadrian's reign, again before he comes to Britain, as a watchful female divinity, if you want, a goddess, an armed goddess, who's obviously loyal to Rome and is defending the frontier. Now, that's been taken to indicate, and I do believe this, that Britain was relatively settled. I mean, the province of Britain was relatively settled because Britannia is actually a loyal subject to Rome, intent on defending the frontier on these coins. Now, later on, provincial coins were issued for other provinces of the empire, And this Britannia coin is, I suppose, really a model for some of those later coins. So perhaps the uprising beyond the northern frontier was really serious. Unfortunately, we have very little actual direct evidence for it, just comments by a couple of classical authors and a few archaeological discoveries. When we work with this and the information we have, well, most archaeologists now suspect that Hadrian ordered the construction of the wall in 121, and his intent was to visit Britain, actually inspect the line under construction, so he could see how his orders were being carried out. And this is partly because we know the frontier works in Germany start the year before from this very detailed work on dendrochronology. Now, we can't prove that for Hadrian's Wall, but that would mean that what we're celebrating this year, this summer, is actually Hadrian's visit to Britain, not the 1900th anniversary of the start of the building of the wall. And indeed, it's also suspected that Hadrian actually changed the instructions for the wall, that initially it was going to be a relatively simple but very monumental structure, mainly a large stone wall with a turf wall at the western end and a mile castle every mile along its length. But this seems not to have been adequate because around this time, we can't date it exactly, but around the time we think Hadrian's visiting, these plans seem to have been changed and more military forces were moved to the line of the wall. So we got what's called the fort decision, and we have a number of Roman forts constructed to supplement the military units and the mile castles. Now, also, if you come to Hadrian's Wall, we've got this monumental, actually massive second frontier work called the Vallum, which lies just to the south of the wall. And that seems to be another measure to increase the security of the frontier, quite probably instructed by Hadrian during his visit. Now, this is derived from archaeological research over decades. We have no classical author who actually tells us this. So I'm pulling together fragments of information to argue this way, and also the scholarship of previous archaeologists and ancient historians. Also, it's worth wondering why, because the main monument to Hadrian being in Britain is obviously this wall. Why was the wall so large and monumental? Now, the frontier works around the empire were massive, substantial, heavily manned structures, but Hadrian's Wall seems to be particularly large and also is very significant because it's built of stone. So a lot of the Roman frontiers were actually of timber and earth, but in Britain they built in stone. And the reason for this, I would argue, and this is the argument in the book, is because Britain had a particular place in the mind of the elite of the Roman Empire. Obviously, Hadrian is an example of one of these people, but Hadrian was following in the footsteps, or I should probably say the wake, because they sailed in the sea, of divine Julius Caesar, the emperors Claudius and Vespasian. All these three predecessors had at least partly made their names by campaigning in Britain, and Britain was high profile in the mind of elite Romans. It was also a magical land set in the ocean, and the wall effectively stood in the place of the Romans actually achieving a final conquest of the entire mainland of Britain. Now, this conquest had been attempted about 30 years earlier, before Hadrian came to Britain, by the very famous commander Agricola, but the Romans had pulled back after this, and obviously the conquest of the entire island was either not achievable with the manpower they had, or not justified by what they'd actually succeed in acquiring by conquering the whole of the north of Britain. So Hadrian's Wall effectively stands in place of the conquest of the entire island, or the completion of the conquest of ocean. And perhaps building such a monumental wall actually is intended to symbolize the importance of Britain and the fact that they've found an alternative way of controlling Britain. Well, I suppose one thing I would stress, and I've been talking about this a bit already this year, and I'll keep saying it, is when we think about Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the anniversary this year, it's probably actually the visit of Hadrian to Britain. He was a Roman emperor. He's known today as one of the sort of most effective and probably one of the most positive emperors. It's the date of his visit to Britain rather than the date of the starting of the building of the wall, which we're commemorating this summer. And that's really my summary of the book.